In this video, I tell you about a trick that I use to learn game systems more quickly. So I fear that this happens to people quite frequently. They get a new game system, something they're all excited about. It's maybe a skirmish game, maybe it's a big mass battle game, maybe it's something independent, maybe it's something made by a big company, Games Workshop, for example, whatever. To be perfectly honest, this trick sort of applies not just to tabletop miniatures, wargaming. It can be for board games. It can be for lots of different things. But because I mostly play the tabletop wargames, that's why it applies to tabletop wargames for me. So you get this book home and you start reading it. And you might go through the fluff. You know, a lot of people like the fluff. I generally enjoy the fluff. I enjoy good fluff. For those of you who think I've been saying fluff too much and don't know what I'm talking about, what fluff is, it's a kind of a shorthand in gaming for the storyline, the background, the world building, all that kind of stuff. It's generally known as fluff. So, fluff. I've said it again. Anyway, you go through a lot of that stuff generally. If you're me, I like to read it. If it's well written, and then you start going into the mechanics of the game, sometimes also known as the crunch. You have the fluff and the crunch. I don't know. I don't make these up. I'm just telling you what they are. So you start going through the mechanics and you start reading it, and they're telling you about what dice you're going to use and what size the board you're going to need, and they're going to tell you how to figure out how to move and how to shoot and how to punch people and how to jump up walls and all these different little things. And you go through and you read it, and it probably doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense. And my fear is there are people who go, "Oh, I don't understand this," and that's where they stop. And maybe they go back to the game that they've been playing for a long time and they don't, move into this new game. Or worse yet, they just don't play the types of games that you and I like to play in general at all. And that's kind of a bad thing. But there's a trick to getting past that. That, like I said, I thought it was just me, but I've been talking to a bunch of people. And again, like I said, this past weekend, and it's not just me, it's probably you too as well. So here's the trick. You've gone through and you've read the book, the mechanics, the crunch. You've gone through and it does not particularly make sense. Every once in a while, there's people out there who can read through a rule set once and it's like they see the matrix and they're like, okay, cool, I get it. And they know it better than the person who wrote it probably. And those people are cool, and I'm not one of them. But for the most of us, the rest of us, generally we're befuddled by the first read-through on any game system, and it's difficult. But if you kind of push forward, here's what happens. You go and you fumble through the first game. Sometimes you fumble through it alone. I have done that. It's a bummer, but sometimes you just set up two groups of models and you follow the rules and go, okay, these guys didn't do this. And you just go back and forth like that until you start to get used to it. It's more fun if you play with a friend, even though the both of you are fumbling through the rules, but still, it's more fun when you do that. But if you don't have that outlet, or if it's late on a Saturday night and no one's returning your calls because they're all out ice skating, I don't know, I just made that up, then, this is what you do until you can actually get some people at the shop or whatever to start playing the game along with you. But you fumble through the rules. You get things wrong. You misinterpret rules. You do a lot of different things. If you're me, you pull out your phone a lot and look up questions and stuff like that, especially if it's a more well-known game that you're just getting into. And hopefully there's forums out there that say, other people have stumbled across these same problems, but you fumble through the game. Maybe you don't do the entire game. Maybe you only do a portion of it, but, or maybe you just run through one turn so that you kind of figure out the different phases and go through all that stuff and you get it going. Best is to, in my opinion, try to fumble through an entire game. Maybe it takes you twice as long as what they say that the normal game should take, and that's generally the case when you're first learning. It makes sense. But you fumble through that first game. It's not a tournament. You should never go to a tournament as your first playthrough on a game. That's a terrible idea for everybody involved. But just you and your friend, or maybe you by yourself, trying to figure it out, going back, looking at the instructions, discussing what do you think this means, that kind of stuff, until you get the game finished. Now, you might think to yourself at this point, you might say, well, gosh, this is going to take forever. That game was problematic at best. How am I expected to try to keep doing this until I enjoy it as a hobby when this rule set is so difficult for me. Maybe the rule set's great. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just bad at things, whatever the deal is. And you start to get this self-doubt. And what I would tell you at this point is to stop, calm down, and read the rule book again. There is something magical that happens when you've read a rule book. It doesn't make any sense. Like, you don't have the context. You're like, I don't, I see all these words, but they don't really particularly make a ton of sense. When you actually put it into action, even though you're fumbling through it horribly and you have to back up and redo parts and all this kind of stuff, you fumble through that first game, or potentially maybe a couple of games if you can do them quick. Like if it's a skirmish game, you might be able to get through 2 in an afternoon/evening, whatever. But you fumble through them, and that, at least for most people that I've talked to who've been like, that happens to me too, you get this sort of context phenomenon that happens in your brain. And now when you pick up the book again and you start reading it, it's like someone had been giving you the book previously in a language that you barely read. Like, I don't particularly read French. I took a little French in high school. I could be like, that word's cheese. I know that, but that's about as good as I'm going to get. And it's like as if the person took that book away and then was like, oh, sorry, here's it in English. And then I'm like, oh, well, I can read that. It's amazing how after reading through something and then fumbling through the playthrough and then coming back to the book, everything makes more sense. So that's really the plan. Perfect plan in a perfect world is you read through the rule book and then you go to a local convention or something like that, game convention, and a person who either works for the company, or maybe even the person, if it's a small indie company, somebody who actually wrote the rules, then runs you through it. And then you're like, hey, thanks, I really appreciated that demo. That was really cool. And then you immediately scuttle off someplace and pull out the book again and start reading, and it will be as if the scales have fallen from your eyes, and it will make so much more sense. Believe me when I tell you this, if you start reading through a book and you're like, I don't get this at all, I am not understanding this rule system at all, I guess I'll just read the fluff and then cry myself to sleep. Push through it. Finish the rule system, read it, get it figured out. Even go back and look at some parts that are like super confusing, but you're just like, well, okay, I get all the words. I still don't understand how it works. Then fumble through a game or a couple by yourself or with some friends or whatever, and then go back to that book, because you will be astounded at how all of a sudden everything just falls back into place. And you're like, oh yeah, now I know why that happens. And oh sure, now that makes sense. And it's just, and then you will learn so much more quickly and be able to go on to say your second game, or if you played a couple of games, now your third game, and then your fourth, and then you will become an old pro very quickly when you do it that way. Don't give up. Don't half read the rules and then try to fumble through it. That might not work. Go through, read the rules. And rules are getting shorter, so it's not like it's going to take you forever. But go through, read the rules, then fumble through. Fumbling through a couple of games, or at least even one, is key. And then come back really quickly. Unless you've got like a super good memory. Like for me, I would need to come back almost instantly and reread the rules then, because my memory is garbage. But you do that, run through it, and it will make so much more sense. The things that you're reading will just come together, and then your next game and your next game and your next game will get better, and you will have fun, which is the point of playing games. Don't let anybody tell you differently. You should be having fun. So, yeah, you have to understand that just because it's difficult when you first read any rule system, they're all like that. Even if it's really, really, really a streamlined kind of cut down, you'll still be like, I don't understand. I get this. Yeah, okay. Movement. I move 6 inches because this guy says it's 6 inches and I know how a ruler works. Awesome. But a lot of other stuff sometimes can really trip you up. Even if you're an old pro and you've been playing miniatures games for years, someone else will write a miniatures game, a war game, and this can even be for a board game or even for CCGs and things like that, that their idea of what rules mean might be very different than yours. So it's not a slam dunk like, oh, I've played this, so this is very much like it. This could be very different than this other rule system. And sometimes the smaller indie companies sometimes don't write things as clearly as they could because they don't have a staff of like English majors or whatever, who do the editing and do all that stuff. Very frequently, like, my good friend Peter and I wrote a game years ago, and neither of us is an English major. And we wrote it, and then we gave it to some friends of ours, and we're like, "Look, here, go play test this." And then we, took off and went to a different room. And they were back in about 3 minutes, and they're like, "Quite two questions: how do you start the game, and how do you win the game?" And that's because we knew how the game was put together, and we knew how to end it. And so we just wrote all the middle stuff, initiative and movement and melee and, and how to fight and all that kind of stuff. But we never wrote that other stuff because it just seemed obvious to us. You can be too close to it. So lastly, just read the rules, go through it. Even though it's confusing, try to fumble through a game. Try to fumble through 2 if you really got to be, you can do it. And I guarantee you when you come back to, and you should immediately come back to that rule set, it will make tons more sense. And then you'll be a lot smarter and happier with your gaming for doing so.